Take a look at this famous painting, Las Meninas by Diego Velázquez, and your eyes will immediately be drawn to the little girl at the centre. Swathed in white and gold silk, Infanta Margarita Teresa of Spain stands as the ultimate symbol of the Golden Age royalty. She's innocent, gilded, and utterly ethereal. But behind the canvas lies a vastly different reality. What the art history textbooks rarely tell you is the grueling, heartbreaking story of what happened after the paint dried. Margarita Teresa would grow up to become the Holy Roman Empress, a pawn in a brutal dynastic chess game that would cost her her life at just 21 years old. And her tragedy did not end with her. Her only surviving daughter, Maria Antonia, would inherit the terrifying genetic weight of the Habsburg Empire, embarking on a life defined by political manipulation, a loveless marriage, and a heartbreakingly similar fate. Hello, I am Dr. Amy Boyington, and today we are doing a deep dive into the lives, the hidden experiences, and the tragic deaths of two generations of Habsburg women who paid the ultimate price for the crowns they wore. To understand Margarita Teresa, we have to understand the toxic genetic soup into which she was born on the 12th of July, 1651. Her father was King Philippe IV of Spain, and her mother was Mariana of Austria. If you look at their family tree, it doesn't branch out, it collapses inwards. Mariana was actually Philippe IV's biological niece. This extreme inbreeding was a deliberate political strategy designed to keep the vast Habsburg lands from falling into foreign hands. While Margarita Teresa's younger brother, Charles II or Carlos II, would become history's most famous victim of this genetic bottleneck, suffering from severe physical and mental disabilities, Margarita Teresa initially appeared to escape the worst of it. She was pretty, vivacious, and her father's absolute favourite. Philippe famously referred to her as his little darling and his joy. But a Habsburg princess's childhood was short. From the moment she was born, she was destined for one thing: Vienna. The man chosen for her was her maternal uncle and paternal cousin, Holy Roman Emperor Leopold I. Yes, she was to marry a man who was simultaneously her uncle and her cousin. Because Leopold needed to know exactly how his future bride was developing, Velázquez and his studio were ordered to paint Margarita Teresa every few years and ship the portraits from Madrid to Vienna. It was a 17th century equivalent of a long-distance relationship, tracked entirely in oil paint, albeit with a child and a man. As a result of this, we have a remarkable record of how Margarita Teresa developed and grew up over the ages. By 1664, the marriage contract was officially settled. But just as the teenage Margarita Teresa was preparing for her grand departure to Vienna, tragedy struck the family. Her beloved father, King Philippe IV, was dying. Overburdened by decades of war against France and Portugal, and haunted by the knowledge that he was leaving the Spanish Empire to a sickly infant son, the king's health rapidly collapsed. He suffered from severe dysentery and fever, spending his final days in excruciating pain. On the 17th of September, 1665, Philippe IV died. For Margarita Teresa, it was an agonising emotional blow. Not only had she lost her greatest protector, but his death threw her imminent marriage into complete chaos. The Spanish court plunged into strict royal mourning, delaying her departure for months. Worse still, her mother, Mariana, now had to step in as regent for the fragile new king, Charles II, Margarita Teresa's brother. Suddenly, the 14-year-old Margarita Teresa found herself in a suffocatingly tense palace, mourning the father who had adored her, while realising she was now a political pawn under the sole control of a stressed regent and a desperate government. In the summer of 1666, the mourning period finally permitted her to leave. She said a final bittersweet goodbye to her fractured home and travelled by sea to Italy before making a spectacular royal entry into Vienna. Leopold was smitten. Despite his rather grim appearance and deeply religious gravity, he found his young bride absolutely enchanting. Their wedding was one of the most extravagant spectacles in Viennese history. They celebrated with an open-air opera called Il Pomo d'Oro, the Golden Apple, which cost a staggering 100,000 florins. For a brief moment, Margarita Teresa was the glittering new star of Europe, but the reality of being an empress was about to set in. Leopold and Margarita Teresa were genuinely affectionate towards one another. He called her his only Margareta, and she called him her uncle, and they shared a great love for music. But the primary duty of an empress was not to be a companion, it was to produce a male heir. And this is where Margarita Teresa's life descended into horror. In the span of just 6 years, she was plunged into a relentless cycle of pregnancies. Her fragile, heavily inbred body was subjected to the brutal physical toll of childbirth year after year. This is, of course, bearing in mind that she was still a teenager. In 1667, she gave birth to a son, Ferdinand Wenceslas. He lived for less than a year. In 1669, she gave birth to a daughter, Maria Antonia, the only child who would survive to adulthood. In 1670, another son, John Leopold, died within hours of his birth. And in 1672, a daughter, Maria Anna, lived for only 20 days. Imagine the awful psychological trauma that she was suffering. On top of this, Margarita Teresa was living in a foreign court, where she was constantly criticised for keeping her Spanish retinue. The Viennese courtiers intensely disliked her. They hated her rigid Spanish manners and blamed her entourage for her inability to produce a healthy male heir. Desperately lonely, grieving 4 dead children, and under immense pressure from a court that viewed her womb as political real estate, her health rapidly deteriorated. By early 1673, Margarita Teresa was pregnant for the 7th time. She was profoundly weak now, her body thoroughly broken by the constant miscarriages and infant loss. On the 12th of March 1673, Margarita Teresa's body finally gave up. It is said that she died from a severe case of bronchitis. She was 4 months pregnant and only 21 years old. Leopold apparently was utterly devastated. He wrote that losing his only Margarita was a grief he could barely articulate. She was buried in the Imperial crypt in Vienna, leaving behind a grieving husband, an anxious empire, and a lonely 2-year-old daughter called Maria Antonia. With her mother gone, the young Archduchess Maria Antonia became a solitary figure in the sprawling Habsburg palace. Her father quickly remarried only 4 months later, and Maria Antonia was left in the care of tutors and governors. Yet, as the only surviving child of Margarita Teresa, Maria Antonia was not just an ordinary archduchess. She carried a massive geopolitical prize on her shoulders, a legitimate claim to the entire Spanish throne. Because her uncle, King Charles II of Spain, was childless and chronically ill, Maria Antonia was suddenly one of the most valuable diplomatic matrimonial prizes in all of Europe. Maria Antonia grew up well educated, deeply pious, and remarkably intelligent, but she was also quiet and melancholy. She knew from an early age that her heart, her desires, and her body did not belong to her. They belonged to the state. Her father, Emperor Leopold, used Maria Antonia as a human bargaining chip. To secure an alliance against the rising power of France, he betrothed her to Maximilian II, the Elector of Bavaria. He was a dashing, aggressive military commander, known for his ambition and his love of luxury. On paper, it was a grand match. In reality, though, it was a disaster. They were married in Vienna in 1685, when Maria Antonia was just 16 and he was 23. The young archduchess was uprooted and sent to the court of Munich. If her mother had found Vienna hostile, Maria Antonia found Munich to be an absolute prison. Maximilian was a notoriously unfaithful husband. He openly paraded his mistresses in front of his new bride, insulting her dignity and treating her less like a wife and more like a political trophy. Maria Antonia reacted by withdrawing into herself. She spent her days in deep prayer, isolated in her private apartments, writing desperate letters to her father in Vienna. The Bavarian court viewed her as cold, arrogant, and dull, completely ignoring the fact that she was a deeply depressed, lonely young woman trapped in a hostile environment. Just like her mother, Maria Antonia faced immense pressure to secure her husband's dynastic ambitions by providing an heir. Her first 2 pregnancies resulted in immediate tragedy. 2 sons born in 1689 and 1690 both died in infancy. But then came 1692. Maria Antonia gave birth to a 3rd son, Joseph Ferdinand. This little boy was born into a storm of global politics. Because of his mother's Spanish bloodline, international treaties actually designated this newborn Bavarian prince as the primary heir to the vast Spanish Empire. He was the child who was supposed to prevent a massive pan-European war. But the birth of this saviour child came at a horrific cost. The grueling labour completely shattered Maria Antonia's already fragile health. Plagued by what was likely postpartum depression and systemic infections from the birth, she fell into a deep, unshakable melancholy. She knew she was dying, and in a final heartbreaking act of defiance against her abusive husband, Maria Antonia signed a will before she passed away. In it, she completely disinherited her husband, leaving her vast claims and her personal fortune directly to her infant son, under the guardianship of her father, Emperor Leopold. On Christmas Eve, the 24th of December 1692, Maria Antonia died in Vienna. Just like her mother, she was incredibly young, only 23 years old. She was buried in the Imperial royal crypt next to her mother. 2 generations of women, both dead in their early 20s, both utterly consumed by the terrifying demands of the Habsburg dynasty. But history has one final, incredibly cruel postscript to this story. What happened to that baby boy, Joseph Ferdinand? Well, in 1699, at the age of just 6 years old, the young prince suddenly fell ill and died in Brussels. Rumours of poison ran rampant through Europe, though it was likely a sudden illness. With his death, the carefully constructed peace collapsed. His uncle, Carlos II of Spain, died a year later, and because there was no longer a compromised heir like Joseph Ferdinand, Europe exploded into the War of the Spanish Succession, a bloody, devastating conflict that lasted for over a decade. All the suffering, all the forced marriages, and all the deadly pregnancies endured by Margarita Teresa and her daughter had been entirely in vain. So, the next time you look at Velázquez's Las Meninas, don't just see a masterpiece of light and shadow. Look closely at that little girl in the centre. Look past her beautiful dress, the jewels, and the courtly elegance. And remember the human being behind the canvas. Remember Margarita Teresa, the young girl who lost her adoring father on the eve of her wedding, who was traded to Vienna, and who lost so many children before the age of just 21. And remember her daughter, Maria Antonia, who died on Christmas Eve at 23. They were daughters, mothers, and princesses, but above all, they were the human casualties of an empire that valued land and titles far more than the lives of the women who built it. Thank you so much for listening. I am Dr. Amy Boyington, and I hope that you've enjoyed it. If so, please like, comment, and subscribe. Thank you.